What the heck is consciousness? Consciousness is a term that I see ill-defined frequently. What I mean by that is that the definitions or the way it's used are confusing or ambiguous or not explained. I'm not suggesting that I have the proper definition of consciousness because there are multiple definitions, but what I want to offer here is a workable or useful definition, model, and understanding of consciousness as it relates to thought in the context that I'm usually referring to, which has to do with awakening and realization. So to start off, I want to try to keep it as simple as possible. By way of simplicity, I want to point out that consciousness is not something you have to find. You're experiencing it right now. It's the most basic thing you're experiencing right now. It's the most simple aspect of your experience right now. It's the space of you. It might feel like an internal space, maybe even a hidden space, but it's an intimate space. It's the closest you can get to who or what you are. So it's right there where you are. That's consciousness. Also, consciousness is any thought that arises in that space. So any thought, if it's a self-referential thought saying, oh, this makes sense, I kind of get it, or this makes no sense whatsoever, I have no idea what he's talking about. Those thoughts are formulations of consciousness. They are movements in consciousness, sort of like waves on an ocean. They're not apart from consciousness, but they're not the entirety of consciousness. They're fluctuations in consciousness. Consciousness is the space in which thoughts occur, but it's also the space in which the sense of you occurs. When this is obvious, when this sameness of I am, self, just pure awakeness and thoughts is discerned, this often correlates with an awakening or a significant shift in what you take yourself to be in identity. So that's a starting place. I don't want to overcomplicate things. And as a fallback, consciousness is just the feeling of you, the feeling of being the awake, alert one, that which has not changed since you were 2 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old, 40 years old. Can you find the place inside of you that's always just as it is? That no matter what thoughts have come and gone, what experiences have come and gone, what people, relationships, pains, pleasures have come and gone, it hasn't changed. It's just sort of aware of all of it. That's consciousness. And also, any thought that forms, if you're willing to see it as a thought and become curious about the nature of thought, the structure of thought, the texture of thought, you'll notice it's not apart from that conscious space of you. And yet it doesn't actually change what you are. How is that possible? When you see that directly, it'll click. So this next model of consciousness I'm going to describe is a little more subtle in the description and detail, and it can easily be made too conceptual, too thought-based. So hold it lightly if it's not helpful or confusing or leads you to just conceptualize and analyze and think and compare to other beliefs and thoughts, then just let it go. It's not particularly helpful. But at some point, and particularly when awakening deepens or experiential insight of pure consciousness or unbound consciousness deepens, this model can be helpful to recognize how consciousness and thought fit in with equanimity, how they fit in with not stirring the pot and keeping the ripples of thought ongoing unnecessarily and more importantly, keep the polarity inside consciousness ongoing, which causes us to continue to go unconscious or partially unconscious. So here's the model. Imagine a substance. We could call it a fluid substance, which means it could be something like a liquid or even something like a gas that exists in 3 dimensions. So it's behind, above, below, and front to each side infinitely. It's as if you're in an infinite vast ocean with nothing but the ocean, or nothing but the contents of the ocean, which would be water, or the contents of an endless atmosphere that has no planet, that has no surface, that has no upper limit, lower limit, etc. Also, consider that this space of fluidity is homogeneous. So it doesn't have things floating in it. It's all of the same exact substance. Now, what are the qualities of this fluid or this space? Well, I could describe a few different qualities, but the most important quality I will describe is that it's a knowing space. It has the ability to know, to become aware of. And it's intrinsically self-aware, meaning it knows it's a knowing space. Now, that can twist up the mind if you start thinking about it, but if you feel into it, it might make sense. So it knows it's a knowing space. This awareness, this self-awareness, this consciousness doesn't have to have an object of knowing to be pure knowingness. Okay? So that's the most important quality of it. And you can see now that with just that single quality, it can be completely without content. There's no thinking required to be knowing knowingness or pure knowingness, right? Now, you might intuit what that means, or that might just drop you right into it and just stay there if that does. Or you may get a glimmer of it and then notice that this space of consciousness feels far more cluttered, dynamic, and maybe even dramatic than I just described. That's thought. So the underlying spaciousness and knowingness does not require thought, but in most of our experience, it is drenched with thought. We've developed a habit many, many, many years ago, early in childhood, to start using thought in a certain way, using the mechanism of pushing and pulling inside consciousness. And we've been using it ultimately for a certain kind of escape or respite from the fear of life, from the pain of life. And we could call that thinking. And at some point, that thinking became so solidified, so continuous, that we forgot we were a thinker. Or being a thinker could only be one more thought. But we've overlooked this purity of consciousness, this purity of knowingness, requiring no thoughts or objects. Pure being. We've pretty much forgotten that's possible because there's so much dynamism inside of this fluidity. So the second quality of this fluidity that I want to describe, the first being knowingness, the second quality is that it's potentially reactive. Now, it's very strange to talk in this way because while it is potentially reactive, it has this magic ability to be moving and still at the same time. I can't explain that because to the thoughts, it doesn't make sense. Thoughts will say it's either moving or still. But once you really drop into this, you can start to appreciate the paradox of movement and stillness being one and the same in consciousness. That being said, this second important quality of this fluid is that it's easily turned into a dynamic process. And that is the introduction of will, personal will inside of this. The finger on the scale gets the scale swinging wildly in both directions. It doesn't take much, actually. And so we've learned to put our finger on the scale of thinking, of thought, so long ago that we've forgotten we're doing it. The finger's kind of on the scale all the time, pushing it up and down. And we've forgotten that we've basically neglected the outside world and replaced it with thought and thought objects. And now we're pushing and pulling on thought objects, thinking it's the external world. So consciousness has this ability to seemingly formulate the substance of the sense world, but as an internal experience, not the actual sense world, right? And just for clarity, you can imagine an elephant right now, but it didn't appear in the room you're in. So thoughts and the physical sense world are not exactly the same thing. And I would argue they're not ever the same thing, even if they seem to be. So in this three-dimensional substance that moves in every direction, the introduction of a small amount of personal will cause this sort of rippling effect, a sort of polarizing effect inside of that consciousness where a subject pulls back inward that feels like you. This is not the same you as I am. This is the thought-based you. But we often overlook that and we just focus our attention on the seeming movie screen that's created on the other side of this polarized experience in consciousness, and that's thought. That's why if we really start to pay attention, we just see thought after thought after thought after thought after thought, right? Just like a train of thoughts. So what's happened by this point is that seeming polarity inside of consciousness that you feel, it's not just a belief, you feel like a separate self apart from a separate world, none of which is actually happening. It's only consciousness and the way we're utilizing consciousness and the way we're pushing and pulling on thoughts that's creating that illusion, but it feels very real. It feels very separate. This is why when we have that first shift, when we find ourselves just as that consciousness, as the knowingness, completely unqualified by any thoughts, undistorted by any thoughts, it's such a huge relief. It's a very distinct feeling of non-separation and pure knowingness. And it's a relief because there's nothing to do here. We don't have to do anything to protect ourselves or to become something because we're already everything we could ever become in this space. And we know it intuitively, it's obvious. It's more real than real because what we took to be real before were just fragments of reality, of the reality of knowingness. So now it's just pure knowingness. So this model can be helpful when you recognize that introducing personal will inside of consciousness, pushing and pulling on thoughts, thought objects, which will look like beliefs, people, the world, your ideas about the world and people and situations. That's what actually keeps that pot stirred and keeps that sense of subjectivity being pulled into a sense of view of self apart from everything, suffering self. That's what keeps it going. And as you recognize this and you start to work toward equanimity and recognize the difference and the cognitive distortion between what's actually happening and what you imagine you want to be happening, this polarity calms more and more until it just stops. And it can just stop until the reactivity goes to basically zero. It's possible. So this model is sort of geared toward that deeper insight into equanimity and the function of introduction of will inside of consciousness and how it becomes important to actually notice and recognize how we stretch that rubber band in every direction and it just keeps snapping back and we don't know why until we realize what it means to stretch the rubber band, what it means to polarize ourselves inside consciousness and push and pull on what we think is reality, when indeed we're pushing and pulling on our own internal reality, creating a sense of an external world that feels alien, foreign, distorted because it's not the actual world. And also the sense of self, which feels alien and distorted because it's not the actual self, not the big S self, which is different than the big ass self, which someone pointed out in my previous comments. So hopefully that's helpful, but this model can be helpful once you can intuit this mechanism. Before that, it can be a little too theoretical and conceptual. So if it feels that way, just let it go.